People think desperation looks like crying. It doesn't. Desperation looks like a perfectly steady hand holding a $40 glass of Merlot, waiting for the exact right second to ruin a man's night. Or her own life. Nora didn't trip. She didn't catch her heel on the rug. She looked Victor Russo dead in his exhausted, heavy eyes, and she tipped the glass right down the front of his bespoke grey suit. The entire ballroom stopped breathing. He didn't flinch. He just leaned in, the smell of ruined wine and expensive cologne filling her lungs, and whispered, "You're coming home with me." The charity gala smelled like copper and bleach, hiding beneath a thick layer of Tom Ford. It was the kind of room where people smiled with their teeth, but never their eyes, where a misplaced word could cost a person their business, and a misplaced hand could cost them their fingers. Nora stood near a towering ice sculpture of a swan that was already beginning to melt, letting the condensation drip onto the knuckles of her left hand. She needed the cold. She needed something real to ground her, because everything else in this room was a lie, including her. Her dress was a rented piece of midnight blue silk that pinched her ribs and dragged too long on the floor. It felt like armor, but flimsy armor, the kind that shatters the moment a blade touches it. And there were plenty of blades in this room. Most of them belonged to the men standing in a loose protective semicircle near the far end of the ballroom. In the center of that semicircle stood Victor Russo. He didn't look like a monster. That was the most terrifying thing about him. If one walked past him on the street, they might think he was a tired hedge fund manager or an architect who worked too many late nights. He was tall but not hulking. His dark hair was cut short, threaded with early silver at the temples, and his face was carved in lines of permanent exhaustion. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, listening to a sweaty city councilman talk, and he looked incredibly profoundly bored. But Nora knew what he was. Everyone in this city knew what he was. The docks, the unions, the quiet disappearances of men who owed the wrong people money, all roads led back to Victor. Men like her brother. Finian had always been a gambler, but he used to stick to sports bets. $100 here, 50 there. Then he found the underground tables. Then he found Victor's people. $200,000 later, Finian was in hiding, and Nora was the one fielding the phone calls. They gave her a week. That was 6 days ago. She didn't have 200 grand. She didn't have 2 grand. What she had was a rented dress, a borrowed invitation to the mayor's annual fundraiser, and a deeply stupid plan. You don't get a meeting with Victor Russo. You don't call his office. You have to force an interaction. You have to become a problem he needs to solve. Nora picked up a fresh glass of red wine from a passing waiter's tray. The stem felt delicate, fragile, easy to snap. She took a breath. Her heart wasn't fluttering. It was slamming against her sternum in slow, heavy thuds. Thud, thud, thud. Each beat felt like a countdown. She started walking. She didn't look directly at him. That was rule 1 of surviving predators: don't make eye contact until you're in striking distance. She kept her gaze on the crowd, adopting the slightly dazed, slightly vacant smile of a woman who had enjoyed a bit too much champagne. She wove through the politicians and the socialites, feeling the heat of the room press against her skin. 20 feet. 10 feet. The bodyguards noticed her. She saw the subtle shift in their posture. A man with a broken nose and a tailored tuxedo shifted his weight to his right foot, casually blocking her direct path. She didn't hesitate. She allowed her ankle to wobble slightly, overcorrecting her balance, and veered to the side, cutting a sharp angle that brought her past the guard and directly into Victor's personal space. He turned his head. His eyes were dark, flat, and remarkably still. Nora didn't pause. She let out a sharp, fabricated gasp, pitched her weight forward, and drove her shoulder into his chest. At the exact same moment, she flicked her wrist. The wine left the glass in a thick, dark arc. It hit the lapel of his pale grey suit jacket, soaking instantly into the wool, splashing across the crisp white collar of his shirt and dripping down his silk tie. The red stain bloomed like an open wound against his chest. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't a gradual quieting of the room. It was a violent, sudden severing of all sound. The string quartet in the corner missed a note, then dragged to a screeching halt. The clinking of glasses ceased. The sweaty councilman took 3 rapid steps backward, his face draining of colour. The guard with the broken nose had his hand inside his jacket before the wine even hit the floor. Nora stood there, clutching the empty stemware, her chest heaving. She looked up at Victor. She expected rage. She expected a backhand that would put her on the marble floor. She expected him to snap his fingers and have her dragged out into the alley. He didn't move. He looked down at the ruined suit, watching the last drop of Merlot fall from his lapel to the polished floor. Then slowly he raised his eyes to meet hers. There was no fury there. There was only a cold, analytical calculation. He looked at her face, her trembling hand, the cheap shoes peeking out from under her rented dress. He saw right through the performance in a fraction of a second. He stepped into her space. The heat coming off him was immense. He leaned his head down, his mouth hovering just inches from her ear. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You're coming home with me," he whispered. His voice was gravel and ash. He pulled back his face, a perfect mask of polite distress. He reached out and wrapped his hand around her bare upper arm. His grip wasn't bruising. It didn't need to be. It was the grip of a steel trap snapping shut. "My apologies, gentlemen," Victor said, his voice carrying easily across the dead silence of the ballroom. "It seems my evening has been cut short." He didn't wait for a response. He turned toward the exit, taking her with him. Her feet moved because they had to. If she stopped walking, she would be dragged, and keeping up appearances felt like the only shred of dignity she had left to cling to. Victor's stride was long unhurried, but eating up the ground. The crowd parted for them like water. Nobody offered her a napkin. Nobody asked if she was all right. They just stared their eyes wide, with a mix of relief that it wasn't them and morbid curiosity about what was going to happen to her. They hit the double doors of the hotel lobby, and the cold October air slapped her in the face. It felt incredibly good. It felt like reality. A black SUV was already idling at the curb. The bodyguard with the broken nose he had shadowed them the entire way out yanked the rear door open. Victor didn't push her inside. He just applied a fraction more pressure to her arm, a silent command. She climbed in. The leather seats were freezing. Victor slid in beside her, and the door slammed shut, cutting off the sounds of the city traffic. The sudden quiet of the cabin was suffocating. The tinted windows turned the bright streetlights into muted, watery blurs. The heavy partition separating them from the driver was already raised. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly. Nora sat with her hands in her lap, staring at her own white knuckles. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, nauseating sweat. She had done it. She had gotten his attention. Now she was trapped in a moving steel box with the most dangerous man in the state, and she suddenly realized she hadn't planned a single step past the spilled wine. I am so sorry," she pushed the words out. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. She forced herself to look at him. "My heel caught on the rug. I didn't mean to—" "Stop!" He didn't yell. The word was spoken quietly, conversationally, but it carried the weight of a falling anvil. It shut her mouth instantly. Victor took a linen handkerchief from his pocket and methodically dabbed at the wet stain on his lapel. The fabric was ruined, of course, thousands of dollars gone in a second. He looked at the red-stained handkerchief, folded it neatly in half, and set it on the center console. "I deal with liars for a living, miss." He let the sentence trail off, turning his head to look at her. "Nora," she said. "Nora Hastings. Nora." He tested the name out as if weighing its value. "I deal with liars every day. Professional liars. Politicians. Thieves. Men who would swear on their mother's grave that the sky is green. I know what a lie sounds like. I know what a lie looks like." He shifted in his seat, turning fully toward her. The streetlights passing outside washed his face in alternating bands of stark light and deep shadow. "You didn't trip," he said quietly. "Your ankle didn't roll. You stepped over the hem of your dress, planted your foot firmly, and executed a deliberate, forceful shove. You even adjusted your grip on the glass a second before impact, so the liquid would project forward, rather than spill backward onto your own hand." Her breath hitched. He had seen all of that in the span of 2 seconds. "It was sloppy," he continued, his tone clinical. "But it got the job done. The question isn't whether it was an accident. The question is why." She swallowed hard. The lie was dead. There was no point in trying to resuscitate it. But giving him the truth right now felt like handing him a loaded gun. "I needed to talk to you," she said, dropping the shaky apologetic routine. Her voice was steadier now. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the panic was receding. "You couldn't call my office?" he asked dryly. "Your receptionist is very thorough, and I didn't think, 'Please don't kill my brother,' was an appropriate message to leave on a voicemail." Victor stared at her. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the car was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. He didn't blink. He just studied her face, pulling apart her features, looking for the cracks. "Your brother," he finally said. He leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes. "You're Finian Hastings's sister." He knew. Of course he knew. He probably knew what she had for breakfast. "Yes. He owes me a lot of money, Nora." "I know. He has avoided my collectors. He has ignored my warnings. And now he sends his sister to throw cheap wine on me at a public event. Is this his idea of a negotiation tactic?" "He didn't send me," she said quickly. "He doesn't know I'm here. He's an idiot, Mr. Russo. He's a coward, but he's my brother." Victor opened his eyes and looked out the window. They were off the main avenues now, heading up into the hills where the estates sat behind high iron gates. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands," he murmured. "A bold, incredibly stupid move." "I was out of options. People out of options jump off bridges. They don't walk up to me." He turned back to her, his eyes dropping to her collarbone, then back up to her face. "You want to make a deal. That's why you did this. You want to buy his debt." "Yes." "With what?" he asked softly. The question wasn't mocking. It was a genuine inquiry into her sanity. "You're wearing a rented dress. Your shoes have scuff marks you tried to polish out with a Sharpie. You don't have my money." "No," she admitted. "I don't." The SUV slowed, turning sharply. The heavy iron gates of a sprawling compound slid open in front of them, the security cameras tracking their approach. "Then I guess," Victor said, as the car rolled up a long, dark driveway, "we're going to have to find out what else you have." The house wasn't a mobster movie cliché. There were no marble gargoyles or gold-plated door handles. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern structure of glass steel and dark wood, embedded into the side of the hill like a natural rock formation. It looked expensive, minimalist, and entirely unlivable. It looked like a museum where someone had died. The car stopped. The driver killed the engine. Victor opened his own door and stepped out into the crisp night air. Nora followed, pulling the thin silk of her dress tighter around her shoulders. The crunch of gravel beneath her shoes was obnoxiously loud in the quiet of the estate. The city was spread out below them, a glittering carpet of lights. But up here, it felt like they were entirely disconnected from the world. He didn't wait for her. He walked up the wide stone steps to the front door, placed his thumb on a biometric scanner, and pushed the heavy door open. She hesitated at the threshold. This was it. The point of no return. Walking into this house meant playing by rules she didn't know, but turning back meant Finian was a dead man. She stepped inside. The interior was stark. Polished concrete floors, vast expanses of glass, looking out over the city, and low modern furniture in shades of charcoal and slate. The only warmth in the room came from a massive gas fireplace built into a stone wall. Victor walked straight to a low credenza that served as a bar. He shrugged off the ruined suit jacket, wincing slightly as the wet fabric clung to his shirt. He tossed the thousands of dollars garment onto a chair without a second thought. He didn't pour wine. He reached for a heavy crystal decanter filled with dark amber liquid and poured 2 generous measures into lowball glasses. He turned and held one out to her. She stayed near the door. "I don't drink. You do tonight," he said, walking over and pressing the glass into her hand. His fingers brushed hers. They were warm, calloused. The physical contact sent a jolt up her arm that she violently suppressed. "Drink it. You look like you're going to pass out, and I don't feel like carrying you." She took a sip. It was Scotch peaty and harsh. It burned all the way down, leaving a trail of fire in her chest. It grounded her. Victor walked to the fireplace, leaning his shoulder against the stone. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, making the sharp angles of his jaw look even harsher. He took a slow drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let's skip the preamble," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large, empty room. "Finian owes me $240,000. With interest, let's call it $250. I gave him a deadline. He missed it. In my line of work, missing a deadline has consequences. If it doesn't, people stop taking deadlines seriously." "I understand how it works," she said tightly. "Do you?" He tilted his head. "I don't think you do. If you understood how it works, you wouldn't be standing in my living room trying to play let's make a deal. You would be helping your brother pack a very small bag." "I can pay it back." Victor laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, devoid of humor. "How are you going to spill wine on people for a living? I have a job. 2 jobs, actually. I can make monthly payments. I can sign over my car. I can—" She stopped. The desperation was leaking into her voice, cracking the cynical armor she was trying so hard to wear. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He took another slow sip of his scotch. "You're missing the point, Nora. I don't need your car. I don't need your $200 a month installment plan. I am not a bank." He set his glass down on the mantel. "I am a man who maintains order through fear and respect. Finian disrespected me. The money is secondary now. It's about the message. So kill him then." She said the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her voice was shaking. "If it's just a message, do it. But you didn't. You gave him an extension. You let me in your car. You brought me to your house. Why? If he's a dead man walking, why are we standing here?" Victor paused. A flicker of something surprise, maybe amusement, crossed his eyes. He pushed off the stone wall and walked slowly back toward her. She forced her feet to stay planted. She didn't step back, even as he closed the distance, until he was standing only inches away. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. Without the suit jacket, the damp white shirt clung to the broad expanse of his chest. He smelled like Scotch expensive soap and male heat. "You're very observant," he murmured, looking down at her. "And entirely too reckless for your own good." "Why did you bring me here?" she repeated, refusing to break eye contact. He reached out. She flinched, but he just caught a stray strand of hair that had fallen across her face and tucked it gently behind her ear. The gesture was shockingly intimate, entirely out of place in this cold room, in this cold conversation. "Because Nora," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising to meet her eyes again. "Your brother is boring. His debts are boring. His fear is boring." Victor stepped back, a dark, complex smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "But you spilled a glass of wine on me, ruined my evening, and then demanded a seat at my table. You are not boring, and I am willing to forgive your brother's debt entirely, if you agree to my terms." The trap was sprung. She could feel the steel teeth closing around her. "What terms?" she asked. Victor picked up his glass again. "You're going to belong to me." "Belong to you?" She repeated the words slowly, letting the sourness of them coat her tongue. A bitter, involuntary laugh scraped its way out of her throat. "What is this, a bad movie? You want me to be your captive girlfriend, wear diamonds and look pretty, while you order hits from the dining room table." Victor didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He just watched her cynical outburst with the detached patience of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "I don't need a girlfriend," he said, setting his glass on the mantel. The sharp clink of heavy crystal against stone echoed in the massive room. "And I certainly don't need another pretty empty head in my life. I have plenty of women willing to wear my diamonds, Nora. None of them had the nerve to assault me in a room full of my own men." She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the cold air against her bare shoulders. "Then what? I am transitioning a large portion of my organization into legitimate, taxable enterprises: real estate, commercial development, philanthropy." He said the last word without a trace of irony. "The city requires a certain image for these permits to clear. They don't want Victor Russo, the alleged racketeer. They want Victor Russo, the reformed businessman." He closed the distance between them, his footsteps completely silent on the polished concrete. "My usual associates do not clean up well. They look exactly like what they are. I need a face, a partner for public events, charity galas, ribbon cuttings. Someone smart enough to follow a conversation regarding zoning laws and sharp enough to know when someone is trying to screw me." He stopped, hovering just at the edge of her personal space. "Someone who knows how to lie with a straight face." "A PR stunt," she said flatly. "An asset," he corrected. "A highly visible, tightly controlled asset. You will move into this house. You will attend the events I tell you to attend. You will smile for the cameras, you will charm the politicians, and you will make me look entirely, boringly human." "For how long?" 6 months. She stared at his collarbone. The damp red stain of the wine she threw at him was already drying into a rusty brown crescent. 6 months. Half a year of sleeping in the devil's house, eating his food, pretending to be the woman who tamed him. "And Finian, your brother's debt is zeroed out the moment you sign the non-disclosure agreement." Victor's voice dropped the gravelly register, vibrating in the quiet room. "But if you try to run, or if you intentionally sabotage my public interests, his debt is reinstated, with a penalty, and my collectors will not be asking nicely." It wasn't a threat. Threats were loud. This was a guarantee. "Why me?" she asked, looking up into his eyes. They were dark, exhausted, and completely unreadable. You could hire a crisis management firm, an actress, a lawyer. A lawyer will bleed me dry. An actress will panic the first time a reporter asks a hard question. He reached out his knuckles, lightly brushing the side of her neck. The touch was freezing. You walked into a room full of killers to save a brother who doesn't deserve it. You don't panic, Nora. You calculate. He turned his back on her and walked toward a heavy oak desk in the corner of the room. He pulled open a drawer, retrieved a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. Read it. Sign it. Tomorrow morning my men will pack your apartment. She walked over to the table. Her legs felt hollow. She picked up the pen resting beside the folder. She didn't read the pages. There was no point. She wasn't negotiating a salary. She was buying a life. She flipped to the last page and signed her name. Victor watched her from across the room. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. "Welcome to the payroll," he said softly. Moving into Victor's estate didn't feel like a kidnapping. It felt like being buried alive in Kashmir. Her new bedroom was larger than her entire old apartment. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below a bed that felt like a cloud, and a closet filled with clothes she hadn't bought. Designer labels, neutral colors, elegance stripped of any loud personality. She was allowed to keep her phone, though she assumed it was cloned and monitored. She called Finian on the second day. He cried. He swore he was getting clean, that he was moving to Portland, that he owed her his life. She hung up, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. He was alive. The trade was made. For the first 4 days, she barely saw Victor. He was a ghost in his own house. She heard the low murmur of his voice behind the closed doors of his home office. She saw the sleek black SUVs come and go at odd hours of the night. Her only real company was Gabe, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Gabe was technically the head of estate security. Functionally, he was her warden. On the 5th night, the ghost materialized. She was in the kitchen, a massive expanse of white marble and stainless steel, staring into a refrigerator that held more sparkling water than actual food. "Wear the emerald slip dress," a voice said behind her. She jumped, slamming the refrigerator door shut. Victor was leaning against the doorframe. He looked immaculate in a dark navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted. The exhaustion was still etched into the corners of his eyes, but it was masked behind a sharp, predatory focus. "We have a dinner in 40 minutes, he continued, glancing at his watch. "The mayor's deputy chief of staff and 2 developers from the east side. We need their zoning approval for a waterfront project." "Am I supposed to know anything about waterfront zoning?" she asked, leaning against the cold marble counter. "No. You're supposed to look as though you find waterfront zoning utterly fascinating." 35 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of his car, the heavy silk of the emerald dress slipping against the leather seats. Victor sat beside her, scrolling through a tablet. The silence between them was dense. The restaurant was downtown, exclusive and aggressively quiet. They were led to a private dining room in the back. The 3 men waiting for them stood immediately when Victor entered. They were soft men. Men who spent their lives in boardrooms, not back alleys. They smelled of expensive cigars and nervous sweat. Victor played the host perfectly. He was charming, attentive, ordering expensive wine, and guiding the conversation away from anything explicitly illegal. She sat beside him, playing her part. She smiled, she nodded. She drank sparkling water and picked at a $60 piece of fish. 2 hours in the conversation turned to the actual deal. The structural reports on the soil density near the docks are problematic, Victor. The older developer, a man named Arthur, said. He dabbed at his sweaty upper lip with a napkin. The city council is going to balk at the reinforcement costs. We might need to reduce your stake to 40% to cover the risk overhead. Victor's jaw tightened. Just a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only tell. Nora looked at Arthur. His hands were folded on the table, but his thumb was rubbing aggressively against his index finger. He was lying. Or at least he was hiding something. The soil density, she asked. Her voice cut through the quiet room like a bell. All four men turned to look at her. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, a silent warning. She ignored it. "Yes, Miss Hastings," Arthur said condescendingly. "The ground near the water is unstable. It requires deep pile foundations. It's an engineering issue." "That's strange," she said, taking a slow sip of her water. "Because the city finalized a new seawall project directly adjacent to that parcel 3 months ago. They wouldn't have broken ground if the soil required specialized deep pile foundations without publishing a revised geological survey. And no such survey was filed, which means the city's engineers signed off on the stability of the entire grid." The room went dead silent. Arthur's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The deputy chief of staff suddenly found his water glass fascinating. She turned her head to look at Victor. He wasn't looking at the developers. He was staring at her. The cold, dead expression he usually wore was gone, replaced by a dark, intense heat that made the breath catch in her throat. "Arthur Victor," said his voice, dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. He didn't look away from her. "Did you really think you could invent a structural crisis to skim 10% off my end?" "Victor, it's a standard contingency. The deal is 60-40. Victor interrupted, finally turning his predatory gaze on the developer. "My favor, and you will cover the permit expediting fees, or you can find new financing for the entire project." Arthur swallowed hard. 60-40. The ride home was heavy. She stared out the window, watching the city lights smear into long neon streaks. She had crossed a line. She hadn't just looked pretty. She had actively participated in his business. "How did you know about the seawall project?" Victor asked suddenly. "I read," she said, not looking at him. "I lived in an apartment that had black mold and a broken heater. I spent a lot of time in the public library to stay warm. You read the municipal papers when you're bored enough." She felt his eyes on the side of her face. He didn't say anything else. But when the car hit a pothole and she braced her hand on the seat, his fingers brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. 2 weeks later, the illusion of the reformed businessman shattered. It was 2 a.m. Nora was sitting on the floor of the massive, dark living room, a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders, reading a paperback by the light of a single table lamp. The house was usually silent at this hour. Tonight it wasn't. She heard the roar of an engine coming up the driveway far too fast. Tires shrieked against the gravel. A heavy car door slammed, followed by the sound of boots hitting the stone steps in a hurried, uncoordinated rhythm. The front door burst open. She stood up, dropping the book. Victor stumbled into the foyer. He was alone. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his tie was gone. And he was bleeding. A dark, wet stain covered the left side of his ribs, soaking through the expensive cotton. His breathing was ragged, shallow. He leaned heavily against the console table, his head dropping forward. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She didn't think. She just moved. "Victor." He snapped his head up as she approached. His eyes were wide, glassy, with pain and adrenaline. His right hand instinctively dropped to the waistband of his trousers, resting on the dark grip of a pistol. The sight of the gun made her freeze. "Stop right there," he ground out. His voice was a raw scrape. "You're bleeding," she said, keeping her hands visible. "Let me call Gabe." "No." He pushed off the table, swaying slightly. "No guards. Nobody comes in here tonight. The leak is internal." The paranoia in his voice was terrifying. This wasn't the untouchable boss she had met at the gala. This was a cornered animal. He staggered toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. She followed him, keeping her distance. He made it to the marble island before his knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the counter, a low groan escaping his clenched teeth. "Where is the first aid kit?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady. He looked up at her, fighting to keep his eyes focused. The sheer force of his will was staggering to witness. "Bottom drawer, by the sink." She pulled out a massive trauma kit. It wasn't a few Band-Aids and aspirin. It was a professional med bag, the kind you find in an ambulance. She hauled it onto the counter and unzipped it. "Take the shirt off," she ordered. He hesitated. For a second, the Mafia boss tried to reassert control. He glared at her. She glared right back. "You can bleed out on your custom marble, or you can take the shirt off," she said, ripping open a package of heavy gauze. "I don't care either way, but I prefer not to mop tonight." A weak, breathy sound left his mouth. It took her a second to realize it was a laugh. He fumbled with the remaining buttons, his fingers slick with his own blood, and let the ruined shirt drop to the floor. The cut wasn't a bullet hole, thank God. It was a slice, deep, ugly, and running along his ribs. It looked like a knife wound. "Sit on the stool," she said. He obeyed. She stepped into his space. Up close, the smell of copper was overwhelming, mixing with the scent of adrenaline and expensive cologne. Her hands were shaking. She forced them to stop. She took a bottle of saline and poured it directly over the wound. Victor's entire body went rigid. The muscles in his chest and arms corded tight, but he didn't make a sound. He just gripped the edge of the marble counter, so hard his knuckles turned white. "Breathe," she murmured, pressing a thick pad of gauze against the laceration. "It's an occupational hazard," he ground out, his jaw clenched tight. "Getting stabbed?" Disagreements in negotiations. She applied pressure, leaning her weight into her hands. He hissed, his head falling back. His throat was exposed, vulnerable. She could feel the rapid, heavy thumping of his heart against her palms. "Who did it?" she asked, focusing on the dark red soaking into the white cotton. "Someone who won't be attending tomorrow's board meeting." The coldness in his voice was absolute, a chilling contrast to the heat radiating from his skin. They stood there in the quiet kitchen for 10 minutes. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged pull of his breathing. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. He was the one bleeding, reliant on her hands to stop it. She was the one holding the pressure. She carefully pulled the gauze back. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze. She grabbed the medical stapler from the kit. "This is going to suck," she warned him. "Just do it, Nora." She lined up the edges of the skin. Click. He flinched. Click. A harsh breath through his nose. Click. 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 When she finished taping a sterile dressing over the staples, her hands were covered in his blood. She stepped back, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving her legs feeling like lead. Victor looked down at the bandage, then up at her. The glassy look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a heavy, intense clarity. He reached out and wrapped his hand around her wrist. His grip was weak, but the heat of it burned right through her skin. "Why didn't you run?" he asked quietly. "The door was open. I was bleeding out. You could have walked out." She looked at his hand on her wrist, then up to his face. "Because running means Finian dies." "Is that the only reason?" His thumb brushed a smear of his own blood off her forearm. The gesture was slow, deliberate. It wasn't a threat. It was a question, and it was the most dangerous thing he had done to her yet. Yes, she lied. Her voice didn't waver, but her pulse hammered violently against his grip. Victor didn't call her on the lie. He just let go of her wrist, the ghost of a dark, knowing smile touching his lips, before the mask of exhaustion slammed back into place. "Go to bed, Nora," he whispered into the quiet kitchen. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." The smell of bleach woke her. It was sharp, chemical, and entirely out of place in a house that usually smelled of expensive cedar and lemon polish. She lay in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, piecing the previous night together. The blood. The staple gun. The cold, heavy grip of Victor's hand on her wrist. She threw back the covers and walked out into the hallway. The kitchen was spotless. The marble island gleamed under the morning sun, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The bloody rags, the ruined shirt, the trauma kit, all of it was gone. A woman in a grey uniform was aggressively scrubbing the floorboards near the foyer. Victor was sitting at the dining table. He was wearing a dark charcoal turtleneck, a tactical choice to hide the thick bandages wrapped around his ribs, and nursing a black coffee. He looked up when she walked in. The color in his face was poor. The exhaustion had settled deeper into the lines around his mouth, but his eyes were sharp. "Gabe is taking you to the city today," Victor said, his voice a low rasp. "No good morning. No, thank you for not letting me bleed to death. You have a fitting at 2 o'clock. A dress for the hospital, benefit on Saturday." She walked to the coffee maker and grabbed a mug. "You shouldn't be going anywhere on Saturday. You have 8 staples in your side. If you tear them, you're going to a real hospital, and they have to report knife wounds." "I am going to the benefit." "So are you." She poured her coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the quiet room. "You said there was an internal leak. Someone in your own circle put a knife in you, and you want to walk into a crowded ballroom 3 days later." "Exactly," Victor said softly. She stopped. She turned around and leaned against the counter, holding the hot mug in both hands. He was baiting a trap. "If I don't show," Victor continued, staring into his coffee, "whoever paid for that knife knows it found its mark. They know I'm weak. They know they can make their next move. If I show up looking perfectly fine, smiling for the cameras with my beautiful partner on my arm, they panic, and panicking men make mistakes. And if they decide to finish the job at the benefit, they won't. It's too public. They need me dead quietly, or they need me completely out of the way. A public assassination brings the feds. Nobody wants the feds." She took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Who do you think it is?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He picked up a tablet on the table and slid it across the smooth wood toward her. She walked over and looked down. It was a security dossier. 4 men. "My lieutenants," Victor said. "Leo handles the docks. Thomas handles the unions. Barrett runs the underground tables. And Dominic manages the offshore accounts. One of them is tired of working for a living. One of them wants the chair. And you want me to do what point at the guilty one? I want you to do exactly what you did with Arthur and the zoning permits," Victor said, finally looking directly at her. The intensity in his gaze pinned her to the floor. "I want you to watch them. I am too close to these men. I have known them for a decade. I see the history. I need someone who only sees the data. I'm a barista and a part-time receptionist, Victor. I'm not a human lie detector. You're a survivor, Nora. Survivors know how to read predators. It's the only way they stay alive." He slowly pushed himself up from the table. A tiny, involuntary grimace flickered across his face, gone before a normal person would have caught it. But she wasn't normal anymore. "Be ready by noon," he said, walking slowly toward his office. We have a long week ahead. The fitting was a blur of raw silk and pins. The dress was a deep blood-red velvet. It hugged her ribs, draped perfectly over her hips, and featured a slit that ran dangerously high up her left thigh. It didn't look like a dress she wore to play the supportive girlfriend. It looked like a dress she wore to start a war. When Gabe drove her back to the estate, there were 4 black cars parked in the driveway. The lieutenants were here. She walked into the house, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. The heavy oak doors to Victor's office were slightly ajar. She could hear the low, rumbling cadence of men arguing over money. She didn't go upstairs. She walked to the wet bar in the living room, poured a glass of sparkling water, and sat on the low leather sofa, positioned perfectly to see the reflection of the office interior in the massive glass windows facing the city. She watched. Leo was loud. He paced, waving his hands. Barrett sat entirely still, smoking a cigar he shouldn't have lit in the house. Dominic was furiously typing on a laptop, ignoring the others. And then there was Thomas. Thomas was the quiet one. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, his hands resting on his knees. But his eyes never stopped moving. He wasn't watching Victor. He was watching the door. He was checking the sight lines. His right foot kept tapping, a tiny rhythmic twitch against the rug. He looked like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. Victor sat behind his desk, looking like a king holding court. He didn't look injured. He looked terrifyingly in control. An hour later, the doors opened. The 4 men filed out. They stopped when they saw her sitting in the living room. Leo offered a charming, sleazy smile. Barrett ignored her. Dominic gave a polite nod. Thomas stopped. His eyes flicked to her face, dropping to her neck, then back to her eyes. It wasn't a look of appreciation. It was an assessment. He was calculating her threat level. She held his gaze, taking a slow sip of her water, her expression entirely blank. A muscle in Thomas's jaw ticked. He turned and walked out the front door. Victor emerged from the office a minute later. He looked exhausted. He walked over to the sofa and dropped onto the cushion beside her. The scent of his cologne washed over her, mixing with the faint, metallic smell of the bandages beneath his sweater. "Well?" he asked, closing his eyes. "Thomas," she said instantly. Victor didn't open his eyes. Why? He wasn't part of the meeting. His body was in the room, but his brain was 10 steps ahead. He kept checking the doors. He tapped his foot the entire time. And when he looked at me just now, he didn't see your girlfriend. He saw a variable he hadn't planned for. Victor let out a slow, heavy breath. Thomas has been with me for 12 years. He stood as my godfather's pallbearer. "He's the one," she said flatly. "I'd bet my brother's life on it." Victor finally opened his eyes and looked at her. A dark, complicated shadow crossed his face. "You already did." The hospital benefit was held at the Natural History Museum. The massive, vaulted ceilings echoed with the sound of a string quartet and the meaningless chatter of the city's elite. They stood near a towering Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton, holding flutes of champagne. Nora was wearing the red velvet dress. Victor was in a custom tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. Nobody could see the thick band of gauze wrapping his torso. He stood straight, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The heat from his palm bled through the velvet, grounding her in the chaos of the room. They were 3 months into the contract, halfway through the lie. But the lines were blurring. When he touched her now, she didn't flinch. When he looked at her, she didn't look away. The cynical transaction they had agreed upon was mutating into something deeply dangerous. They understood each other too well. "Mayor's approaching at 3 o'clock, Victor murmured, his lips barely moving. She turned, plastering on the warm, untouchable smile she had perfected over the last 90 days. They shook hands. They talked about pediatric wards and municipal bonds. She laughed at a terrible joke the mayor made, and Victor's hand tightened infinitesimally on her waist, a silent acknowledgement of her performance. Across the room, standing near the Egyptian exhibit, was Thomas. He was nursing a drink, talking to a city alderman. But his eyes kept drifting to Victor. "He's staring," she whispered, leaning back into Victor's solid frame. "Let him stare. He's trying to figure out how I survived a blade to the liver. He thinks I must be bleeding out under this jacket." Victor took a sip of his champagne. "He's going to make a move tonight. He has to. He knows I'm closing the waterfront deal on Monday. Once that money clears, my position is permanently solidified. He's out of time." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. "Tonight, here, not in the ballroom," Victor said, smoothly turning to face her. He reached up and brushed a stray curl behind her ear, acting for the cameras flashing near the entrance. "He'll wait until we isolate ourselves. A hallway, the parking garage." "Why did you bring me if you knew it was going to happen?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Because you are my alibi, Nora. And because Thomas wouldn't engage if I was surrounded by 10 guards. He needs to think I'm vulnerable. Walking out of here alone with just you makes me look incredibly arrogant. And arrogance is a weakness he will exploit." She stared at him, the red-hot fury bubbling up in her chest. "You're using me as bait. I'm using us as bait." His eyes were dark, devoid of any apology. "Stay close to me. When it happens, get behind me and do not move. Do you understand?" She didn't answer. She just glared at him, the reality of her situation crashing down. She wasn't just a PR asset. She was a pawn in a game of blood. An hour later, the speeches began. The lights in the main hall dimmed. Victor leaned down. Time to go. They slipped out the side doors, leaving the crowded hall for the quiet, marble-lined corridors of the museum's administrative wing. Their footsteps echoed loudly. The air was colder here, smelling of old paper and floor wax. They reached the service elevator that led to the VIP parking structure. Victor pushed the call button. The numbers above the doors lit up, descending slowly. 5, 4, 3. The heavy fire doors at the far end of the hallway groaned open. She turned. Thomas stepped into the corridor. He was alone. He didn't have a gun drawn, but his right hand was buried deep in the pocket of his tuxedo jacket. "Victor!" Thomas called out. His voice was steady, but it held the hollow echo of a man crossing a point of no return. Victor didn't look surprised. He turned slowly, keeping her slightly behind him. "Thomas, you're missing the auction." "I don't care much for charity," Thomas said, closing the distance at a measured pace. He stopped 20 feet away. "You look good, Vic. Considering. I heal fast." "That's the problem," Thomas said, shaking his head. "You always survive. You always bounce back. But the world is changing. This legitimate business, it's a pipe dream. You're making us soft. You're turning us into politicians. I'm turning you into millionaires who don't have to check their rear-view mirrors." Victor countered, his voice like cracking ice. "I like checking my mirror," Thomas said. He pulled his hand from his pocket. He was holding a suppressed semi-automatic pistol. The matte black metal absorbed the dim hallway light. "I don't want to build affordable housing, Victor. I want to run the city." Thomas raised the gun. He didn't aim at Victor. He aimed at Nora. "You're distracted, Vic," Thomas said, a sick smile twisting his lips. "You brought a liability into the house. Let's see how fast you heal from this." Time fractured. It didn't slow down. It shattered into jagged, blinding shards. She didn't freeze. Her brain bypassed fear and went straight into survival. She dropped. She threw herself sideways, hitting the cold marble floor, just as the dull thwip of the suppressed gunshot echoed off the walls. The bullet shattered the plaster behind where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Victor moved. He didn't pull a gun. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, ignoring the fresh stitches in his side. He crossed the 20 feet before Thomas could adjust his aim. Victor hit him like a freight train, driving his shoulder into Thomas's chest. The gun went skittering across the floor. The two men crashed into the wall. Thomas was younger, uninjured, but Victor fought with the absolute feral violence of a cornered predator. He drove a knee into Thomas's stomach, grabbed him by the throat, and slammed his head back into the marble. The sickening crack of bone on stone echoed loudly. Thomas slumped to the floor unconscious. Victor stood over him, chest heaving. Blood was rapidly blooming across the white shirt beneath his tuxedo jacket. The staples had torn. She scrambled to her feet. Her knees bruised the velvet dress covered in dust. She looked at the gun on the floor, then at Victor. He turned to her, his eyes wild, his hands shaking. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice a ragged bark. "No!" She breathed her heart, hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm okay." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders, checking her over with frantic, rough hands. When he realized she was unhurt, he didn't pull away. He crushed her against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. His breathing was ragged. She stood there stunned, feeling the heat of his blood seeping through the velvet of her dress, feeling the violent, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. This wasn't a PR stunt. This wasn't a contract. "Gabe is in the garage," Victor whispered against her skin. "We need to move." The safe house was a nondescript cabin, 2 hours north of the city. It smelled of pine and dust. It was 4 a.m. Gabe had dealt with the mess at the museum. The official story would be a mugging gone wrong in an alley downtown. Thomas would not be returning to the office. Victor sat on the edge of the small bed in the back room. Nora had just finished retaping his side. It was an ugly, brutal job, but the bleeding had stopped. He looked completely drained. The terrifying boss from the ballroom was gone, leaving behind a man who was simply profoundly tired. She washed the blood off her hands in the tiny bathroom sink and walked back into the room. She sat in a wooden chair across from the bed. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "You moved fast," Victor finally said, staring at the floor. "I told you. I have good reflexes." He looked up at her. "Thomas was right about one thing. You are a liability. When he pointed that gun at you, I didn't think about the docks. I didn't think about the waterfront deal. I didn't think about my empire." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I just thought about the fact that I couldn't let you die." Her breath caught. She didn't look away. "And what does that mean?" "It means I broke my own rules," he said bitterly. "It means I let you become important." He reached to the bedside table. He picked up a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto her lap. It felt heavy. "What is this?" she asked. "The deed to Finian's debt. Paid in full. 0 balance. Along with a new passport, $50,000 in cash, and a plane ticket to London." Victor stood up, wincing slightly. He walked to the small window, looking out into the pitch-black woods. "The contract is void. You're done, Nora. You survived me." She stared at the envelope. This was everything she had wanted 6 months ago. Freedom. Safety. A clean break from the darkness. She picked the envelope up. It felt like holding a tombstone. "I leave for London," she said slowly. "And then what?" "You start over. You get a normal job. You date a normal man who doesn't have people trying to put bullets in him. You forget you ever met me. And you, I rebuild my organization. I finish the waterfront project. I go back to being exactly what I am. She looked at the broad line of his shoulders, the tension radiating off him in waves. He was offering her an exit, but the way he gripped the windowsill told a completely different story. He was waiting for the door to close behind her. She stood up. She walked to the small wood-burning stove in the corner of the room. She opened the iron door. The coals inside were still glowing a dull, angry orange. She tossed the envelope inside. Victor turned around, his eyes widening as the thick paper caught fire. The flames licked up the sides of the envelope, devouring the passport, the cash, the debt. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, taking a step toward her. "I'm burning my exit," she said, slamming the iron door shut. The loud clang echoed in the small cabin. She turned to face him. She wasn't the terrified girl in the rented dress anymore. She was standing in a ruined designer gown covered in his blood, and she had never felt more powerful in her entire life. "I don't want a normal job, Victor. I don't want a normal man. Normal men bore me." She closed the distance between them until she was standing inches away from him. She looked up into his dark, shocked eyes. "You told me you needed a partner. Someone who knows how to lie. Someone who can read a room and spot a traitor. Nora, I am not your captive anymore." She interrupted, her voice dropping low, matching his cadence. "The debt is gone. The contract is burned. Which means if I stay because I choose to. I stay because I want the table." Victor stared at her. The exhaustion in his face vanished, replaced by a slow rising heat. The realization of what she was offering, what she was demanding, settled over him. "You understand what this life is," he whispered, his hands coming up to grip her waist. "You saw it tonight. It's violent. It's ugly. I survived it tonight," she corrected him. She reached up her hands, gripping the lapels of his ruined shirt. "You're going to need a new lieutenant, Victor. Thomas is gone. The unions need managing, and I already know how to read the zoning reports." A dark, terrifying smile finally broke across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just found the one thing he didn't know he was looking for. His grip on her waist tightened, pulling her flush against him. "You're a monster," he murmured, his face dropping toward hers. "I learned from the best," she whispered back. He didn't hesitate. He kissed her with the same desperate, violent energy he had used to fight Thomas in the hallway. It tasted like blood and smoke and absolute ruin. And as his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her deeper into the dark, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. She didn't just spill wine on the boss. She became him. That's how you completely rewrite the rules of the game. Nora didn't just survive the underworld. She looked it dead in the eye and claimed her seat at the head of the table. She proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the Mafia boss. It's the woman he makes the mistake of underestimating. If you loved this dark, high-stakes romance and want more stories where the heroine bites back, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your fellow romance addicts and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have burned that exit money? I'll see you in the next video.